Hey everybody, it is time for maybe my most requested review ever, I think, but today I'm going to be reviewing, finally, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which came out in 1968. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick spent 5 years trying to develop this project, get it off the ground, and I think that obviously during that time he achieved a sort of status in Hollywood that allowed him to have more creative control. Films like Spartacus got his foot in the door in terms of receiving that acclaim, the Academy Award nominations and all of that. And then, he pushed the boundaries even further in 1964 when he made maybe one of the great political satires of its time, Dr. Strangelove. But 2001, I mean, it's far more ambitious than anything that I think Kubrick ever tried before then or since, to be quite honest with you, and I don't think he ever quite topped it in that regard. And this film is probably one of the most argued about films, one of the most interpreted Hollywood films of the 20th century, and there's nothing that I can really say that's going to offer you a new take or something that you never quite thought of before, because this, as I said, this film has been analyzed to death, so all I can really do here is just tell you why I personally think that the film's so special and why it endures conceptually and artistically, and why it's just one of my favorite films of all time. I know I'm so redundant, but it's so true. I mean, I have to say again that with a Kubrick film, it's not like you're just watching a movie. You're not just going to be entertained. You're going for an experience. You are letting the images and the sounds wash over you. It's a very, especially with this film, it's a very meditative, very cosmic, very dreamlike, transcendental experience. It plunges you into the ideas rather than presenting them in front of you in this sort of cohesive narrative structure. And I love that. I hate using this particular term. I really do, but I feel like it works in this particular instance. So this is maybe the only time I'll ever use it. But honestly, this movie was a game changer. It changed the game not only for Stanley Kubrick, but it changed the way movies were made. It changed the culture in the period. It changed the way people processed movies, processed science fiction, and that is kind of an incredibly remarkable. The beginning of the film, or the dawn of man as it's referred to, I think is a brilliant way to see kind of the inception of mankind, the beginning of its evolution. We see the fight for survival between different life forms, the discovery of weapons, which allows us to destroy each other. And that is really like the main symbol, I think, the connective tissue for all the different acts of the film. We find these tools, these weapons, and we believe that they will empower us because they're protecting us. But at the same time, once you discover the ability to hurt other people, other life forms, you realize that ultimately you're going to kind of implode and destroy each other with these weapons. And that idea reverberates throughout the film, but in very different ways. So you've got kind of the bones as the weapons in the very beginning of the film, and then at the end you've got the HAL 9000 as a weapon of a far more advanced sort. When you find the tools to protect oneself, it helps us instantly become self-aware as beings, and that is ultimately our undoing, I think. So when the ape grabs the bone, it's that low angle, and he grabs it and starts banging it around, and that sort of marks the end of that particular stage of evolution and into the next one. And that match cut where the bone is falling in the air, and then it transitions to the ship that looks a lot like the bone in space, and it's going down. That is so good. It's so seamless. It's one of the most brilliant transitions I've ever seen. Every image in this section really connects in a very beautiful, very musical sort of way. First it's the bone, and then it's the spaceship that is shaped like the bone, and then you see the pin floating in the ship. All are connecting ways of expressing the way that we're furthering the species, furthering our civilization. Another thing that I have to talk about is just how, and it's not just 2001, it's almost all of Stanley Kubrick films, they are just so timeless and so epic. You watch these movies and there's nothing dated about it. It amazes me that a film like this could be made at that time, because it just seems so forward. But there are a lot of things that some people don't like about the film. I mean, there is a lot of repetition here. There's a lot of long, drawn out shots that some people find to be tedious, as though they're like watching a screensaver or something like that, put to classical music. But I actually find that quality about the film to be one of the key things in what makes it so meditative. It kind of reminds me of Fantasia. There's something about when you've got this grand, beautiful music and how it's merging with the long drawn out images. And it makes you feel as though you're falling into it. You're becoming one with the art. This is an extremely ambiguous film. Kubrick liked ambiguity a lot. I think, we saw it a lot more in the second half of his career, post 2001: A Space Odyssey for sure. And it doesn't always work for me, but I think here it perfectly reflects the idea of seeing the way life is shaped, but from a distance. We are the distant observers to our own kind here. And the plot here is not very important at all. A lot of people will try to comprehend this film in terms of logic, and that's cool. Some people's minds work that way, but that's far less important to me. I kind of like to push past the logic and explore some of the metaphors, because that allows us to really look deeper into kind of what's making the artist tick. And plus, a lot of art is not logical, so why try to approach it that way? I think that the monolith is maybe one of the best examples of this. People try to understand what it is, where it came from, and all of that. And Kubrick, I love him for this, but he said, I'm not going to tell you what it means. You kind of have to figure out what it means for yourself, because you can interpret it in so many different ways. And I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer. For me, it represents kind of in a broad term. This is something that a lot of people have said, but I think it's very true, is it represents kind of cyclical evolution, the different points of evolution and how they feed into each other. When the apes discover the weapons, we see the monolith. And then when mankind makes that leap to artificial intelligence, there's sort of that break there. And then, of course, at the very end of the film, there's the fetus reaching out to the monolith, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. It reflects open-endedness, which is really interesting as well, because it is, it's just a blank, straight, sharp-edged thing right in the middle of everything every once in a while, and there's something very eerie about that. The Jupiter mission, or the HAL 9000 sequence of the film, is maybe one of the most memorable moments or acts of the film. And I think for good reason. It totally makes sense to me. I think, though, this is an absolutely perfect representation of what perfect filmmaking can be. It's like a horror movie within a science fiction movie, but it's like the best horror movie ever made. The way that it builds with such subtlety is so just remarkable and chilling. I've never seen anything like it, and it perfectly reflects kind of where we're headed, where we're already, honestly, at this point in time, but just the computer era. So many creepy moments in this sequence, and then afterwards as well, but sound is employed impeccably all the time. I love the heavy breathing throughout that sequence, and then how that contrasts with the silence of space. That's just deadening. It's just so creepy. And rather than having, a lot of times in the big climactic moments, like where Hal lets the guy go and he's flying through space, normally there would be like this big epic musical climax hitting that moment, but no, instead it builds and builds and builds, and rather than having like a big moment with a close-up on his face, no, we just see him kind of flying away into space from a window, and it's just completely silent. You don't see that very often, kind of subverting those cliches, but to me, it's far more effective, ironically. But as great as the sequence is, for me, personally, the best part is the final act of the film, and I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you why that's my favorite, but it's certainly maybe the most debated in terms of meaning, and it's the sequence where Dave transcends space and time, and he finds himself in a void of sorts, or sort of like this room with a mashup of different human-made things from different periods in time. Here, Dave is getting to see his timeline sped up, so he's confronted with older versions of himself, and he's kind of dying all at once. And this is some like DMT level, third eye opening, trippy shit. Not only is it very psychedelic, the idea of seeing yourself grow older and die and be reborn all at once, but it's kind of the idea of that time is relative. It kind of is condensed, and there really is no time. So it feeds into that whole idea of life is cyclical, that time is a flat circle, if I'm going to borrow from Rust Cole. All of time and meaning and civilizations are all one. One dies and another begins. It's death and rebirth, death and rebirth. And I love how you can look at that concept of life, death, and rebirth all in one human being, but that also reflects life and the universe at large. And that's why I think that when you see the image of the baby mirroring the earth at the very, very end of the film, it's an incredible image, almost orgasmic. And another image that really gets me is when the baby is reaching for the monolith at the very end of the movie, you know, because it's reaching regardless of what incarnation, what period of time we're in, no matter what era, you know, everyone is trying to reach for the unattainable, reach for meaning, reach for answers. And in doing so, we die out. And then the next generation or the next species takes over in that quest. And then when the camera shoots into the monolith and it becomes space, I find that extremely empowering as a viewer, and there's something very hopeful about it. It's kind of first person, so as if to say, you know, we're the ones in this particular era right now. We are the ones evolving into the next phase of life, and it's all in our hands. And that theme really does kind of remind me of the ending of The Holy Mountain in a way. There's really nothing like this movie out there. I've seen a lot of people try to mimic this movie, but none of them have been successful. And plus it works on its own. Kubrick is his own artist, his own person, and he's got a style that is completely distinct to himself. I think the way that he merges the concepts and the ambiguity is absolutely perfect. It just sings. And I think I said this earlier, but that's something that I think he struggled with later in his career, and maybe even earlier as well. I think he must have really done some inward exploration. I'd like to know what specifically. That would be really interesting, and I would ask him if I could. But I feel like he really had to go there, go to kind of some interesting places psychologically in order to make this film a reality. I can't imagine a movie being made like this today. I just, I mean, it's unfortunate, but I can't imagine any sort of executive who would take a risk as bold as this with this kind of ambition, this kind of budget and scale. But I'm glad that there was a period when that could be done. So yeah, one of my favorite movies. If you haven't seen it yet, and if you're a fan of Kubrick, I really don't know what you're waiting for. And that's my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.